On 12 November 1912, a search party stopped on the Ross ice shelf, beside a shape in the snow. It was the top of a tent, buried to within a foot of its peak. Inside lay 3 men in their sleeping bags, frozen where they had lain for 8 months. One of them had thrown open his coat, as if the cold no longer mattered. Beside them were diaries, letters, and 35 pounds of rock they had refused to leave behind. Their food depot lay 11 miles to the north. 11 miles. So how did the best-equipped expedition of its age die within a day's march of survival? Antarctica in 1910 was still a rumor with an outline. Ships had touched its coast, and in 1909 Ernest Shackleton had come within 100 miles of the pole before turning back to save his men. That near miss set the terms for everything after it. The pole was now close enough to seem certain, and Britain wanted it first. Nobody yet knew what 4 months on the inland plateau did to a human body. Nobody had measured how fast a man burns out hauling a sledge at 10,000 feet. Those 2 unknowns would decide who came home. Robert Falcon Scott was a naval officer, not a showman. He had already led 1 expedition south, and it had left him with an unfinished account to settle. He wanted the pole, but he also wanted science, and he refused to choose between them. His ship Terra Nova sailed in 1910 with 19 ponies, 33 dogs, 3 motor sledges, and a laboratory. He believed disciplined men could outsuffer any obstacle. That belief is the heart of this story. Courage can carry men further than any plan, and still not be enough. In Melbourne, a telegram reached him with 1 sentence and 1 name. Roald Amundsen was going south too. Scott wrote almost nothing about it, and changed nothing in his plans. Terra Nova pushed into the pack ice and needed 20 days to break through. They built their hut at Cape Evans and settled in for the winter dark. Inside the hut, seal blubber burned in the stove, while the air outside fell past 40 below. Then, in June 1911, in the middle of the polar night, 3 men walked out on purpose. Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, and Apsley Cherry Garrard hauled a sledge to Cape Crozier to collect emperor penguin eggs. They traveled 5 weeks in total darkness, in temperatures near 70 degrees below zero. Their teeth cracked in their mouths from the cold. Their sleeping bags froze so hard that forcing a body inside took an hour. A blizzard tore the roof from their stone shelter, and they lay under drifting snow for 2 days. They came back with 3 eggs, and with proof that men could survive the impossible. Cherry Garrard later called it the worst journey in the world. If journeys to the edge of human limits hold you, consider subscribing to Wonders and Frontiers. On 1 November 1911, 16 men, 10 ponies and 2 dog teams left Cape Evans heading south. The plan was a relay, ponies to the glacier, dogs part way, then men alone for the last 400 miles. The motor sledges failed within 50 miles, their tracks shattering on ridged ice. The ponies sank to their bellies in soft snow and were dragged forward by hand. At the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, the last ponies were shot, and the men named the place Shambles Camp. From there, nothing but human muscle would move the sledges. Behind them, the depots they would need on the way back were already thinner than planned. The first crisis came before the climbing began. In December 1911, a blizzard pinned them at the mouth of the Beardmore for 4 days. The temperature rose above freezing, and wet snow soaked their clothes and sleeping bags. They lay in sodden reindeer skin, eating rations meant for the plateau. Scott wrote that the delay was the worst luck of the journey. When the wind dropped, they hauled 12 hours a day up the glacier. Men fell into crevasses to the length of their harness and were hauled out by their traces. At the top, 4 men were sent home, and Scott made a decision historians still debate. He took 5 men to the pole instead of 4. The tent, the rations, and the cooker had all been designed for 4. The question was no longer who would reach the pole, but who could still get back. On 17 January 1912, they reached the bottom of the world and found it already occupied. A brown tent stood on the ice, with a Norwegian flag on a bamboo pole. Inside was a letter from Amundsen, dated a month earlier, asking Scott to forward it to the King of Norway. In his diary, Scott called it an awful place, and wrote of great striving without the reward of priority. They photographed themselves beside that flag, 5 men with frostbite spreading across their faces. Then they turned north with 800 miles to walk and nothing left to win. The second crisis had a name. Edgar Evans, the strongest man in the party, had begun to fail on the plateau. A cut on his hand would not heal. His fingernails lifted away, and his mind began to wander. Some accounts suggest he had also struck his head in a fall into a crevasse. On 17 February 1912, at the foot of the Beardmore, He collapsed in the snow and died that night. 4 men went on, still hauling the sledge and the 35 pounds of rock. Then the weather turned in a way nobody had planned for. Temperatures on the barrier fell near 40 below, weeks earlier than the season should have allowed. In that cold, the snow gripped the sledge runners like dry sand. Their daily distance dropped from 13 miles to 7, and then to 4. The oil in their depots had shrunk because the leather seals on the cans let it evaporate. Here the cause of that buried tent begins to become visible. The third crisis was Lawrence Oates, and it was the one they could not solve. An old war wound had reopened, and his feet were black with frostbite. He walked on for days, knowing he was slowing 3 men who might still live. He asked for the medical case, and Edward Wilson handed out opium tablets to the party. On the morning of 17 March 1912, the blizzard was still blowing outside. Oates stood and said, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He walked into the storm in his socks, and no trace of him was ever found. 3 men remained, and One Ton Depot was still 70 miles ahead. They covered 20 of those miles in 5 days. On 19 March 1912, they pitched their tent 11 miles short of the depot. Inside that depot were food, fuel, and the dog teams that were supposed to meet them. Then the blizzard came down and stayed. For 9 days, the wind held 3 men inside a canvas tent on open ice. They had food for 2 days and fuel for 2 cups of tea each. Scott's right foot had gone black to the ankle. Wilson wrote in his notebook until his hand failed. Bowers wrote to his mother. Scott wrote to the wives of his men, then to his own wife, then to the public. He asked that their people be looked after, and he blamed the weather rather than the men. His last dated entry was 29 March 1912. 8 months later, Edward Atkinson's search party found the tent under a low mound of snow. They read enough to understand, then collapsed the canvas over the 3 bodies and built a cairn of ice above them. They marched south to look for Oates and found only his sleeping bag. So why did they die 11 miles from food? Not from one mistake, but from a chain of small ones. The motor sledges failed, the ponies never reached the glacier, and a 5th man broke the arithmetic of the rations. The oil leaked from its cans, the dog teams were never sent far enough south, and the cold arrived early. Historians still debate how much was bad planning and how much was bad weather. What is known is that no single one of those failures would have killed them. Here is the reversal inside Scott's own story. He believed courage could carry men past any obstacle, and courage is exactly what could not save him. Amundsen reached the pole first and brought every man home, and the world remembered Scott. His diaries were published in 1913 and turned a failed march into a national idea of endurance. Cherry Garrard, who had waited at One Ton Depot with the dogs and turned back, carried that for the rest of his life. The tent is still out there, buried under a century of snow, drifting slowly toward the sea. 3 men lay 11 miles from safety and spent their last strength writing letters to people they would never see again. For more journeys beyond the known world and the people who paid for them, stay with Wonders and Frontiers.